Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this Global Ethics Day event hosted by Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in collaboration with the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. We're just going to get through some quick introductions first. My name is Joshua Costa. I'm a Carnegie Ethics Fellow here at Carnegie Council. I am also a non-resident Peace and Democratic Institutions Fellow at George Mason University. I focus on alliance politics, political economy of security, and democratization processes. So before I introduce my panelists, I just want to go over a few kind of logistical notes. This panel will center around the Council's vision for ethical leadership and good faith cooperation at a time when international cooperation and democracies around the globe are struggling to adapt to global conflict. So time for introductions. As a disclaimer, all three of these professors, their work has influenced my own, so I'm going to be a little biased and plug their work a little bit as I begin. So first up, Professor Paul Post. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he is a columnist for World Politics Review. He recently published a book called We at War, Allied Economic Cooperation in the Great War. Obviously, I recommend you buy it. Our second panelist, Dr. Solon Simmons. He is one of my co-researchers at George Mason right now. I took most of his classes when I was in graduate school. He's a practitioner and a scholar of conflict resolution. He's also the director of the Narrative Lab at the Carter School, and he is the president of the Senate Faculty Committee at George Mason. He wrote a book called Narrating Peace. And then last but certainly not least is Professor Rory Truex. He's an associate professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He also founded an initiative called the Civic Forum Initiative, and his research centers around authoritarian systems and Chinese politics. Okay, so also I want to give a special shout out in the audience because I know he's probably watching, to Professor Alberto Alemano. He is a professor of European law at HEC Paris. And Professor, I know you can hear me because you're watching along with me. I appreciate the feedback after we're done, so much appreciated. Let me explain what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be talking about democratic institutions and authoritarian systems for about 45 minutes before we take questions. And the goal of this is to have a better understanding of what democracy is going to look like in the future and how we got to a kind of fractured multilateral international system. We're going to go through this in two parts. So we're going to discuss democracies and the rise of global conflict. And then part two, how we future-proof democratic institutions. Just as a disclaimer as well, this is not going to be a partisan space. This is a space that I welcome all questions. And also, if you have them, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm not going to distribute them to the panelists until about 15 minutes before we're done. But yeah, just feel free to ask questions. I want this to be kind of a casual conversation, nothing too over the top, given the topic. We're not going to be that stoic. Let's try to end on a positive note, given what's going on. So, okay, let's just dive into questions and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to do a little bit of an intro for everyone watching. So as the 20th century came to a close, the rise of global democracy was pretty prominent. Like ideologically speaking, in the 90s, there was an explosion of democracy. Most scholars know this, that Francis Fukuyama said we've reached the end of history, democracy will spread worldwide. That was the ethos in the 90s. In other words, the nature of governance itself would be democratic from here on out. And the authoritarian system, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, wouldn't matter anymore. Fast forward to today, you have institutes like VDEM reporting that now 3 out of every 4 persons in the world lives in a non-democratic system or an autocratic system. So hardly an explosion of democratic norms. So something happened between the 90s and today that we're going to be discussing with panelists. On top of that, 88 democracies are remaining now, which is not great. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's not a good thing. There is clearly, again, just a little bit of technical jargon. I don't like the term democratic backsliding. I prefer the term democratic erosion. I feel like that speaks more to what's going on in world politics and global conflict. Democratic backsliding would infer that there is an end state for democracy, and that just goes back to Francis Fukuyama's reached the end of history, and I I think that's a little bit of the issue. I think that ethos is what made the system of global governance assume that it would be democratic from here on out. So a few more statistical points, and then I will start asking questions of my panelists, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So not only does 72% of the world's population now live in an autocracy, UCDP shows that conflict is at a historic high on top of this. So there is more conflict now than since World War II. There are about 59 to 61 state-based conflicts. This is the most since World War II, and 2025 did not alter that fact. So we have two issues now within global governance. We have the decline of democratic norms and systems, and we have the rise of conflict. Both of those things create the conditions for autocratic systems to become more normalized in a chaotic, multipolar world. So speaking of multipolar, this is where we're going to start our questions with the panelists. There's a clear shift. There's been a clear shift from a US-led international unipolar system to a multipolar one. There is now a growing tendency of countries or emerging economies that no longer want to be part of a single rules-based international order. You now have international organizations like BRICS being led by China and Russia, trying to do de-dollarization, trying to do anything possible to create a new system where there's spheres of influence instead of a unipolar influence. So my first question, and I'll start with Professor Post. In a multipolar system, can the United States still say it's the first among equals?
Your question goes right to the heart of many things, which is, first of all, the U.S. position in the world, the changing nature of the world, and then, of course, what does that mean for the state of the world, or whether there's order or disorder in the world. And this is still a topic of debate amongst international relations scholars of, are we still in the unipolar moment, which was very much what was happening when Fukuyama made those remarks. And of course, his work had a lot of prominence in the 1990s. Are we instead in full multipolarity of rising powers no longer being rising, but actually being great powers now? China, Russia resurgence, thinking about India's role in the world. Are we in that kind of world? Or are we in a world of uneven multipolarity where the US there are multiple great powers, but the US is first among the great powers, right? And my own view on it is I think we are in a situation like that last case. We are indeed in a multipolar world. We've actually been in this multipolar world for a while. I always point out to people that it was Secretary of State John Kerry back in an interview in 2012, 2013, where he actually made the remarks that he said, we are now in a world that is much more like the 18th and 19th century, not like the Cold War, not like the post-Cold War. So he was already recognizing during that time kind of this shifting of the international system. And what argument could be made is that that shift was something that you could say maybe was a product of US policy. That's something we could debate. Did the US overplay its hand when it was in the unipolar moment? Or was it inevitable that eventually you're going to return to a system of multipolarity? And what we're witnessing now is just the natural outcome of a process that would have happened anyways. And in many ways, I think that is kind of the debate of how to understand US foreign policy today, which is, were there things that the US did that deliberately put us in a position of unipolarity and we could have maintained it and we messed it up? That's one view. There's another view that says the US would inevitably decline and that we would come into this position of multipolarity again. And if you believe that, then that suggests a different set of policies to pursue. And the other one is to also say, no, wait, there's nothing to worry about. We're actually still the unipolar power and we should behave accordingly. And what I find very interesting is when I start looking at, say, the policies pursued by the Trump administration, I see where there's kind of like a conflict within about which of those states there that we're currently existing. And it's very much captured by like America First, right? Because on the one hand, you would say, you could look at America First foreign policy and say that is a foreign policy that embraces the idea that we're no longer the unipolar power. And actually, current Secretary of State Marco Rubio made that comment very clear in his remarks during his confirmation hearings. We're no longer in that state, and we should behave accordingly. On the other hand, you see where President Trump himself makes a lot of comments about the ability of himself, but also the United States, to solve all these problems in the world, to, according to his count, bring peace to at least 7 conflicts so far. We can debate whether that's actually happened. And that would suggest that he still views the US as being in this position of being the dominant power and at least first among equals. So that's for me kind of a way to be thinking about the current situation of where the US is that my own view is that the US we are in a multipolar system. I think on a lot of metrics, we are still more powerful than the other great powers, but the system has absolutely changed. And perhaps we can get into this debate about whether that change was something inevitable or it was a product of, say, foolish US foreign policies pursued in the 90s and the early 2000s.
If the United States is still kind of great amongst great powers, Professor Truex, I have a question for you based on your expertise then. Is it the United States' job to manage China and an autocratic system like China, or is it the job to go more all out and try to defeat China? I'm not saying not necessarily militarily, I mean technologically, politically, because at the end of the day, it is probably an ideological thing, whether a democratic system or a system by the Chinese Communist Party would supplant US dominance. So should the United States, because I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think under the Biden administration was more manage. So what moment should we do now when it comes to powers like China?
The way I would characterize it is, I think US-China policy was characterized by this idea of engagement, this idea that China could be made a responsible stakeholder in the international system. That idea, the Overton window on China policy, meaning the kind of set of acceptable discourse on China, rapidly shifted in the first Trump administration, which the stance shifted to a much more confrontational notion, the end of engagement idea. And then that line of thinking continued in the Biden administration and solidified this idea of strategic competition with China. I think there was a different flavor to the competition. I think the Biden administration prioritized diplomacy, even in tough times. I think they prioritized relationships with allies quite a lot more. But I think if you look at the broad tenor of US-China policy, we've been in this new equilibrium since 2016. And the question is, well, can we defeat China or contain China or stop China's rise? I'm not quite sure we can. I do think there's a tendency in American foreign policy to occasionally overestimate our ability to affect China and affect domestic politics in China. So there are folks still who think that the CCP's downfall is imminent, and that perhaps we can broker that by putting a little bit of pressure, squeezing China with tariffs and sanctions and these sorts of things. I think this reflects a kind of a Cold War mentality, the idea that we could bring about the fall of our ideological adversary. So I as a scholar of domestic politics in China, I'm just soberly believe that the CCP is going to be around for a long time, and we basically have to realize that and figure out some way to coexist with China while also not sacrificing our values and standing up for our allies and partners in places like Taiwan and elsewhere. So I don't know where I would fall in this, but I'm more of a believer in pragmatism with the relationship. And I think there is a danger with excessive confrontation towards China. We've basically pushed them towards Russia, and you could argue that there's an alternative universe where we didn't go down this excessively confrontational path, and maybe China would be more willing to work with us on ending the war in Ukraine and other things. And so I personally believe we need to have at least some diplomatic relationship. I think the idea of containing or defeating China is a self-defeating idea. I don't think that's actually going to work. And it's not necessarily in the interest of the American people either. So I'll leave it there. I could go on for a long time, but I'm curious what the other panelists think.
Yeah, Dr. Simmons, let's put a narrative thread on this now, right? So U.S. foreign policy is that, what Professor Truex said. It's this kind of desire to go after enemies instead of taking a more diplomatic approach, or just kind of this cottage industry within policy that we can export ideology and somehow kind of flip the tide to make something more democratic, make something more reflective of a US-based international led order. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I agree with Professor Truex, it's a little self-defeating after a while when it's constant. So how did we, with Fukuyama's narrative that we've reached the end of history, how do we undo that narrative thread to have a more realist approach and a more pragmatic approach instead of just an approach based off of assumptions? And you know what I mean? We're trying to get past the political moment. It doesn't really matter who's elected. We need to get past this moment where we just kind of assume that something is going to happen because it happened before. So how do we change that?
So I think we've got to bring in the concept of public opinion if we're going to start to answer this question, which is not a typical thing that one pays attention to in international relations. But from a narrative point of view, what I would say is that the public opinion that matters is not necessarily the public opinion of the mass public, but it's of the decision makers who are proximate to power, what we might call the conventional wisdom in each of these major regimes. And one of the things that I've noticed, that I wrote a book many years ago about the development of the American narrative, and the way that I did that was I looked at Meet the Press, which was a television show, the earliest television show. The reason being, you can think of this as an ice core of the political climate of the conventional wisdom. Every week, their business model is to get the leading newsmaker and ask them questions. What you notice there is foreign policy is the number one thing that Washington newsmakers talk about. And the narrative has changed over the years, but the fundamental problem going back to the end of World War II was, how do we spread democracy around the world? How do we spread our ideas around the world? And then it went through various tensions through Vietnam. The big change being Jimmy Carter's attempt to impose a human rights orientation, a kind of a moralistic orientation on international politics, which has had interesting, varied results. Ronald Reagan's return, and then the war on terror, and eventually, I'd say, the retreat from soft power altogether under Donald Trump. But here's the thing: the world still looks to America for leadership in the realm of ideas. That is, they still look to us in a place like Georgia, say, bordering Russia, looks to us in hopes that maybe we will step in and do something. Maybe eventually, with their elections coming, what have you, that we will be someone who will be able to help them. So there's a great opportunity for what I'd call, I don't want to call it ideological leadership, but I'd call it intellectual leadership that's still there. The record of spreading democracy around the world has been rather mixed, I would say, if you look at the history of American attempts to do so, and has always been mixed up in two things. But what newsmakers and lawmakers meant by democracy as they tried to spread it around the world was, one, free enterprise. That was the number one thing. That's the number, and this is why the Cold War played out in some ways the way it did, because the Soviet Union was seen as a threat to free enterprise. The other was elections. So it's a very narrow conception of what democracy and freedom and human rights means, whereas in the developing world, it still means opportunity to be successful. Based on this idea, I just came from a conversation with our president of the university, whose sort of line that he's pitching consistently is, talent is distributed, but opportunity is not. And if you take a global perspective on that, it's glaringly clear that talent is distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And so the United States has not been very effective in engaging in this war of ideas, in this battle of ideas, as one scholar called it, the return of ideology, looking at China and Russia, going back to Daniel Bell's thesis, that we are in a global battle of ideas. We're thinking of it in terms of interests. And yet, as David Hume argued, the reason or interests are the slave of the passions to some extent, and lawmakers and decision makers are not immune to this. So although interest, we might reframe that as interests are the slave of the passions as well. I think that goes too far, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that we have to be paying attention to how people frame, but even deeper than that, how they conceptualize what they're trying to achieve in the world. And so I think the United States probably, if it's going to rise to this moment, which it doesn't appear to be doing, it's going to have to take seriously what is the moral argument that China is making in places like the Near East. What is the argument for why China should build the port in Georgia as opposed to the United States? How do you conceptualize why, no, you need to stand with us in sub-Saharan Africa because we stand for your interests. Look, we stand for free enterprise and elections, and people say, well, we want something else. And it appears that at least China seems to stand for that, even if we suspect that they don't. So I think that this is an important moment globally for the United States to take a serious look at what it's how it thinks about the world, what it's trying to do, and to take ideas seriously. And which is one of the reasons why we focus so much on narrative at the Narrative Transformation Lab.
Yeah, great. So Professor Post, I'll wrap it back to you then. So I remember a quote you had said that great power competition can lead to great power distraction, in this kind of multipolarity that's occurring at the moment. And so going off of what Dr. Simmons says when it comes to narrative, does multipolarity lead to further conflict? Because just for the audience watching, I do conflict. Dr. Simmons knows this. We're practitioners of conflict resolution. So yes, international relations and international affairs is important, but conflict analysis and understanding the root of conflict itself is equally as important, because again, both of those things are running parallel right now. In 200 years, there's been a war every year for 200 years. So something's wrong. And we probably need to get to the root cause of that, not being naive, not saying that all conflict can be solved, but what leads to it? Does unipolarity lead to more conflict, or does multipolarity lead to more conflict? And before you answer it, I'm going to assume the first two world wars were a result of multipolarity, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So that's like my proof for prefacing this, that I think multipolarity leads to more conflict, but you can answer that.
Yeah, no, this is great. We could very much like get into the weeds of this debate. This is very much at the core of like IR, international relations theorizing, and that's been a long-standing debate of, is it multipolarity? Is it bipolarity? Is it unipolarity? Which one is more stable? And of course, because of that, there's an abstract way to answer that question. There's a very practical way to answer that question. I think what I would do is start with the very practical way, which is, regardless of maybe what's happened in the 19th century or the early to mid 20th century, where that was a time of multipolarity, and so you could see where these conflicts arose. I think it is the case that in the current international system, here in the 21st century, the world at war that we currently are in, and that's a phrase that I've used. I had a piece in the Atlantic back in 2023 where I used that phrase, that we're not in a world war, but we're in a world at war. And it's very much captured by the statistics that you shared at the beginning here, that a big driver of that is being in a multipolar system, and this rising multipolar system, or at least the emerging one that was happening. And the reason why is because of the phrase that you just used, which is, my view is that great power competition by itself also leads to conflict, because you will have the powers engaging either directly in conflict with each other or engage in proxy wars with each other. And so hence that can lead to frozen conflicts thawing, due to the great powers wanting to use those conflicts as ways to be able to gain advantages with each other. But it can also lead to this great power distraction. And that great power distraction is where conflicts that maybe didn't have anything to do with the great powers, it wasn't due to like a proxy war erupting because the great powers were intervening, but it's a war that if the great powers weren't distracted, they may have been able to take steps to intervene, to possibly mediate, prevent the crisis from breaking out, or at least shorten the crisis and shorten the conflict. But when you're in a great power, when you're in a world of great power competition, and these conflicts start to multiply, then you're in a situation where they can't step in to be able to address this issue. So, for example, this is one of the reasons why Armenia and Azerbaijan had a conflict. Now, of course, now President Trump claims, well, I solved it, right? But, we'll see what happens again. But part of the reason why their most recent conflict broke out, I would argue, is because Russia typically was that country that would step in and try to mediate between the two. And of course, it was distracted, and it's distracted by its own conflict in Ukraine. You could also argue that the belief of distraction is what also fosters conflict. And what I mean by that is, in part, the war in Gaza. Then I think a key reason why the war in Gaza, the current war, broke out was I think a key reason that October 7th happened was because, and this is by comments by Hamas leadership themselves, they said, no one's going to intervene. No one's going to, the U.S. is too distracted to be able to help out Israel, this is the prime moment. I think it was the second in command at Hamas who made a comment about like the international system is primed for this, and reference the idea that there's just too much going on. Now is an opportunity. There's a window. Now I think they misjudged with that, but the point is that's an example of where there is both the distraction actually leading to major powers not being able to step in to play a conflict mediation role, but there's also other actors who believe that the distraction will prevent them from stepping in, and therefore you will see these conflicts break out further. So that's the way in which I think multipolarity is affecting the current international system.
Yeah. Professor Truex, well, first of all, before I ask you a question, like I'll add my opinion, even though I'm a moderator. So what I see when it comes to the distraction is that I want to shift a little bit to more the idea of electoral accountability. So yes, I agree with you, Professor Post, but also what I see with this, when it comes to autocratic systems specifically, I see this kind of idea of speed, that they can handle something better than a democratic system can, because democracy, everybody knows this, it's very imperfect, and it takes a while sometimes to get towards the idea of democratic consolidation, if that even exists, if that's even possible. And so it's difficult for post-conflict countries to democratize over time, because it's difficult for economic integration, it's difficult to join IOs, it's difficult in general in a world of conflict. So, Professor Truex, my question for you is, which was part of this panel, which was about democratic backsliding in general. On your civic forum initiative, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we agree on this, the term democratic backsliding, like I prefer the term democratic erosion. I think that speaks more to the moment than democratic backsliding. And I just want to talk about those two terms for a second. What is your thought on democratic backsliding in general? Do you think that that's an appropriate term to apply to democracies in general, or do you think that we need to have a better term like democratic erosion?
So yes, the democratic backsliding is the term of the field, it's the term of political scientists. It's not a term most people think about beyond the political science community, although it is starting to make its way into some of the popular discourse. I think personally, I had a conversation with Brendan Nyhan, who's a political scientist at Dartmouth, about this, and he's been doing some writing about it. One of the issues with both the terms backsliding and erosion is that they are passive, and they imply erosion in particular also makes us think of a cliff like eroding because of a river, something very slow, geological. And in some sense, they don't capture the true dynamic, which is democratic backsliding is often the result of assertive, someone being assertive and engaging in an authoritarian power grab. And so I think in a way it is too lenient, and it doesn't call out the actors that are engaging in that power grab. So increasingly, I'm starting to use that type of term relative to even erosion, which is also passive. So I think that's a helpful distinction, and it names the actors that are participating in this type of power grab.
And power grabs there's no uniform set. Like Bukele did something different than what will go on in China. So I agree with you. Like I think the idea of uniformity, like autocratic and consolidation of power, looks different in each place. So I feel like that's an important point that I'll add. Dr. Simmons, to you, since we're on the topic of democratic backsliding and we're on the topic of great power competition, in this age of transactional diplomacy, is there really such thing as alliances even amongst democracies? Can there be a narrative thread for that? Can there be an argument to be made now? Because again, we've covered the fact that we're probably shifting towards unipolarity. Yes, the United States economically and militarily is stronger than most countries still. It's still great amongst great powers, but there is so more conflict than ever before since World War II. And there is an issue of multilateral fracturing. There's an issue of international organizations assisting new democracies. They're not as efficient as they once were. So the concept of alliances, even amongst friends, can that even be a thing right now compared to what's going on?
Yeah, great question. I think that what's new about our current moment, which is different from the entire history of the conversation that I've witnessed before, is that the Republican Party, in particular led by Donald Trump, it has put us in a situation where it's not clear which side we're on. What I mean by that is that for example, a conversation with an influential figure in Milan who was trying to wrap his head around what was happening with the United States in Europe. And there's a way in which the European Union project is not something that Donald Trump would naturally sign on to, in the same way that Vladimir Putin would not necessarily sign on to it. So although there are unstable alliances, so there's not a clear bifurcation between where the United States stands on these issues in the way that it did in the past and where it will in the future. So this is one of the reasons I'm so interested in the history of ideas and arguments, and in particular as they play out among influentials. This is, again, not an appeal to mass public opinion, but to the opinion and ideas that are articulated by those people who are influential in their respective systems. One of the things that I like to talk about in this bizarre moment, in some sense, I think it is a bizarre moment where people are very much lost, is about what our intentions are, is that I don't use the word authoritarian anymore. I mean, I do, but it's a framing device. What I refer to instead, because no one wants authority for its own sake, they always say they want it for something else. Just in the same way, libertarian is a pursuit of liberty. The word I use instead is what I call securitarian, and because the ultimate goal is purported to be security. That is, why do I Bukele take power in the way that I am? So that you can come home and visit your grandmother, because you haven't been able to do so, and now you can. Isn't that great? And you'll hear that in the coffee shops when you talk to people from El Salvador. The goal is security, and this helps to explain what Donald Trump's message is and why he's successful in domestic politics, but also what's happening, I think, with respect to democratic backsliding globally, which is that people want security. Now, what does that mean? And they want it from a moral point of view. They want the security can be, I want to be protected from invaders and foreign armies, but it could also be, I just want to be protected from internal political divisions, which is very important on the Democratic Party side too. Or I want to be protected from agitators and mobs and disruptions and chaos, which is a Hobbesian argument, and I want that domestically. I also want that internationally, and so the race for security is out there. China is very powerful in this, and I think that they have a good argument to suggest that their system is more stable, that they can offer you what you need, and it might not be this moralistic human rights agenda based on a libertarian orientation, but it is the thing that you ultimately want and that people have wanted throughout their whole history. So I think our alliances are in question because the United States has always been uncomfortable with this, let's say, rapprochement with a securitarian imagination. It's never been something that the United States has, and we were born of a revolution against a king, and liberty has always been at the core, and yet we have been overseeing a world order into the Pax Americana for decades. So I think alliances feel unstable because the influentials in those various systems are confused about what their objectives are, and they're figuring it out as they go.
Yeah, that's good. Let's pick up on security. So Professor Post, because you and I have talked about security in the past and this idea of, so is it, in the current moment, is it still the job of the United States to be an indispensable nation? Is it our job to be the police force to provide that kind of security, to say, no, this system still works? Or should we be pulling back and kind of focusing on what's at home? And to be honest, politically speaking, even if you go back to the 2024 election, I think both parties, in their own way, believe that the United States is an indispensable nation. Sure, if you want to bring up Kamala Harris, it was probably more human rights based, and Trump was more America first based. But it still had that kind of thread that, yeah, the United States still is that kind of nation. So what should the role be now? Should we be policing the world, or should we kind of take a step back?
Yeah, I think your question goes back to that tension that I talked about within the idea of America First foreign policy. And that tension being that, on the one hand, if you go back to, and I already referenced this, the remarks of Marco Rubio when he was going through his confirmation hearings, and then he also echoed these remarks in subsequent interviews, he actually brought this point up exactly. He said, at the end of the Cold War and into the 1990s, the U.S. operated as a bit of a world police force. And there was a time where maybe that was necessary, or at least we had the ability to do it. And then he went on to say, we don't have the ability to do that anymore. And he actually went on to make the remark of, and I thought this really stood out to me. He said, there is a lot of horrible things happening in the world. And then there's horrible things happening in the world that are actually in our interest to solve. And we should focus on those. So that would absolutely be a remark of saying the US just isn't in a position to be able to solve all the world's problems anymore. That would be consistent with, I think, the more how people would understand America First foreign policy. On the other hand, I think you're exactly right in that there is this tension, and I think this tension is drawn out in part by Trump's own interests. And what are those interests? He wants a Nobel Peace Prize, for example. That might be part of this interest. But there is this idea that I think Trump still views the US as the indispensable nation through him, that he has the ability to go about and solve all these issues. That, and you even see that not just on the security side, when he will make claims like he just did at the UN, he's made a number of times of, I've solved all these wars, the UN didn't do anything, it required me to step in to do this using American power. He also has made this remark with respect to even economic affairs, in that there are these global imbalances and problems that have hurt the US, but it's also a problem for the world, and my tariff regime is about trying to fix that, right? And we are in a position to be able to fix it. So it's interesting, this tension of America first being, well, America just needs to kind of pull back. We're not in the same position that we were at the end of the Cold War, and we have to acknowledge that, and maybe even pull back to becoming, again, kind of almost a 19th century foreign policy, which I can go into that, focusing on our own hemisphere. But there's still this tension and this desire to want to be the indispensable nation. And my own view is there is still truth to that. There is still truth that the US oftentimes has to play a critical role to be able to address these problems. And I think that's an instinct that Trump still has. But again, it points to this tension of wanting to do that, but also wanting to pursue more of this, like, not, but quasi-isolationist approach.
Yeah. Professor Truex, do you want to add to that? What are your thoughts about? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the idea of the United States. I mean, from an ethical perspective too, because Carnegie Council for Ethics, we're doing Ethics Day. Is there an ethical obligation for the United States to be an indispensable nation in this kind of current context?
I think it would be a shame if the US retreats from a position of global leadership. I think we don't always get it right, but I think our value system is important to have in the international arena. And I think every time we take a step back, powers like China and Russia take a step forward. And so I think as that kind of high level matter, I think it's important for us to continue to exert global leadership. I think the reality is the American people are a bit war weary. There's a feeling that our excessive focus on foreign conflict has led to the kind of degradation of public good provision in this country. We have bad infrastructure, we have underfunded schools, and you see a weird linkage between people on sort of the right wing of the foreign policy spectrum and the left wing of the foreign policy spectrum, both adopting these ideas of restraint or even isolationism because of that. So I think, again, it's about pragmatism. And I struggle with things like Taiwan. I'm a believer in Taiwan. I visited Taiwan this summer. But the reality is the military balance of power continues to shift. Most Americans do not want a war with China. And according to simulations, if there were a great power war with China, it could escalate to nuclear conflict. According to the simulations, 20 to 30% of the time would entail a huge American loss of life. And so I think these are some of the difficult things about how do we stand up for our allies and partners? How do we stand up for the Ukraines and the Taiwan's world, while also being aware of the limitations of our own power? And I think one of the more compelling answers I heard this summer when I was in Taiwan, I asked this question to folks, like, what are we supposed to do? How can the US best support Taiwan? And the answer I got, which really made me get a little misty-eyed, was that we need to reinvest in our own democracy. So there's this idea of beaconism in Taiwan and in China as well, the idea that the United States is a beacon of an alternative model to China. And when our democracy is dysfunctional, when we can't build trains, when we can't educate our students, that erodes support for democracy in China and in Taiwan itself. And so there is an argument, it might sound a bit cheesy, but reinvesting in the United States and reinvigorating our own democracy, our own economy, actually has ripple effects throughout the world in a way that cannot be accomplished with military power. So I really that argument was not something that's always front of mind, but it resonated with me.
Dr. Simmons, your opinion on America as an indispensable nation?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that Rory said. I think is very powerful and gets back to the ethics of this conversation, which is that the beaconism is really important. And the more that I travel and talk to other people, there's just a sense of concern and questioning, like, well, what's going on with you? What's happening there? It just seems so different. So I think that in that sense, there's an inherent discomfort with the Chinese alternative, because although I'm using this other term, securitarianism, to make it somewhat neutral, obviously there are authoritarian tendencies that are pretty clear there, and many people want to get away from that. So if you're looking for, in some sense, Europe is an alternative, but Europe doesn't have the ability to channel its will in the same way as the United States does, especially when it comes to military affairs, and that's become obvious around the world. And so, yeah, I do think that there is an indispensable role that the United States plays, but the challenge, I would say, to this reinvigoration of democracy that we have, that Rory was talking about, is that there's a tension we have in the United States, and I want to bring up the term populism, because there's been a kind of confusion about what does this populist moment mean, and I think that we can get some leverage on this from a narrative point of view. Like, what is the story? Why are people gravitating to this? And I think it's a tension that it goes back as far as the French Revolution, where there's been this confusion about the idea of, well, what is a democracy and what is a republic? And we have both these parties. Why do we have the Republicans and the Democrats? Well, the democracy speaks to Rousseau's general will. It speaks to the demos, the people having a voice, which I always like to say which could mean the 51% kill the 49%. I mean, that's what we tend to not talk about that, but there is a sense in which there's an unforgiving nature to the demos that Plato made a big deal of. And then there's the republic, which is about, at the root, freedom from domination, a sense that you have individual rights, that you ought to be protected from certain sorts of extreme utilitarianism, for example, that there are duties that we have to one another. And so I feel like we have a challenge about in addressing the demands of the demos, which typically have been, we might use the word social demands. That is that the demos wants to have certain kinds of opportunities to be successful, which is a kind of a class struggle kind of mentality. But it can turn that energy against foreigners. It can turn that energy against bureaucrats and elites. And we're seeing that in the United States, which means that if development is a critical piece of this, that is just, especially, I saw a question about Sudan, Sub-Saharan Africa, what is appealing in East Africa about the Chinese model? It's development. It's development stupid, we might say. That's what's appealing about it. And so, is the United States engaging in a way, especially under an America First doctrine, to promote development in the global South? It's not. I mean, I think that the free enterprise model suggests, yes, in the long term, a free enterprise system will be better at generating the economic development, but in the short run, there's a lot of pain, and you see this throughout Europe in the 1830s and 40s. We're seeing it perpetually in the 20th and 21st century, and so therefore, I think the United States is going to have trouble defending its no pain, no gain attitude toward economic growth.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it looks like we have about 15 minutes left. So I'll mix it up. I'll ask some questions from the audience, and then I'll ask some of my own. Professor Post, we talked about this. Just disclaimer to people watching. I did my last semester when I was doing my graduate work. I used Professor Post's work about international organizations and how they assist new democracies. We talked about this. So one of the questions from the audience is, what role do you see for international organizations? Can they play any kind of role in democratic backsliding at the national level? And can their own decision-making be democratic in and of itself?
It's a big question. And, that's the other element of, really, we haven't talked too much about today. So I'm glad that this question was raised, is, we've talked about institutions within countries. We've talked about the international system, how these things might interact. But yeah, institutions at the international level is, of course, the other angle to this, which was very much on display last week at the UN, and thinking about how the UN operates, and thinking about Trump's criticism of the UN, which, by the way, that is something that a lot of folks, myself included, say that's like par for the course. People were like, oh my goodness, he's criticizing the UN for being ineffective. And it's like, actually, no, that's something I think we all can agree on. He had his own, way of saying it about, all they do is send out a nasty letter, but which I think was a reference to Team America World Police. But, the point is that this criticism is a longstanding criticism. And it relates this idea of, if it's a longstanding criticism, if it's something that we all kind of recognize, number one, how far does that travel? Meaning, is that just uniquely a criticism of the UN, but other international institutions are actually quite effective and work very well? Or is it a criticism of just international institutions in general, and they don't really do much? And what's interesting is that debate was playing out even during the 1990s, during the same time as the Fukuyama end of history, right? There was this whole debate that my colleague John Mearsheimer was part of the false promise of international institutions. And part of his argument was that international institutions don't really do anything in and of themselves. They are ultimately reflections of the balance of power. And if that's the case, and you're moving into a multipolar world, then you can't really expect too much of international institutions, because they're ultimately going to just do what the balance of power allows them to be able to do. An example that might be in favor of that would be going back to COVID and thinking about the WHO, and the fact that the WHO wasn't able to respond maybe in the way that people would have hoped that it was able to respond. And my analysis of that is because the WHO was basically hamstrung by the competition between the United States and China. It was, on the one hand, it couldn't take certain measures with respect to data because it didn't want to upset China, but because it wasn't upsetting China, it was also leading to the Trump administration getting irritated. And then we've seen the culmination of that, not so much during his first term, but at the very beginning of this term, he pulls out of the WHO. And so that would be an argument to say that these international institutions ultimately can't change things absent the distribution of power in the international system. On the other hand, you can say that, well, in a system where diplomacy seems like it's in greater need than ever, they offer an avenue for that. And the fact that, these leaders are showing up for forums, whether it is at the UN, and you think about all the different meetings that were happening there. If you think about when a Trump administration official shows up to, or Trump himself goes to the NATO summit, it's like those create these opportunities for the dialogue, for the diplomacy, which in the current international system is something that's needed, and international institutions can help provide that. So that's, there's a lot that we can unpack with this, but I would say those are kind of the ways that I look at this, is that on the one hand, you can absolutely see the limits of international institutions because they do have some, to what extent what they can do is going to be a reflection of the distribution of power. On the other hand, they do provide these forums that allow for diplomacy to be happening in a world where it seems like there's not enough of it occurring.
Just adding to that, do international organizations provide some legitimacy, right? Because in a post-conflict setting, new democracies want to join them. That's what happens. Now, they can't always join the ones that are right away because it takes time, but there is a link, right, between legitimacy and international organizations. So even though sometimes they're a little frozen, I still feel like they serve a purpose, even if legitimacy, that might not be a great reason, but it is something.
That's absolutely right. And that is consistent with the research that I had done previously about why do, say, smaller states like new democracies and so forth benefit from joining international organizations or even forming their own international organizations. But even then, a key part of what makes international organizations work is the fact, or at least that makes them desirable, is that they can be avenues through which you can gain benefits and even signal. It kind of goes back to almost a little bit to that beaconing point that was brought up earlier. But they can serve as like ways of saying, look, we are part of this club that the US is leaders of, and therefore we should be deemed that way, and we want to be protected by you and want to receive resources by you. But if the great powers themselves are moving away from these institutions, then that does lead a question of like, well, how much can they actually benefit by forming their own organizations? There will be some benefits, but it's going to be highly limited. So I do think this is again where part of me is kind of saying that if you're in a situation where the great powers are themselves questioning the utility of these international institutions, it is going to put dramatic constraints, not completely eliminate, but it's going to put dramatic constraints on the extent to which those institutions are also going to be helpful for smaller states.
Yeah, that's a good point. To kind of role play. Switching real quick, Dr. Simmons, there's a question for you from, I'll just say Kevin. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for watching. In a post-truth political environment, how has the traditional relationship between narratives and policy shifted in the realm of U.S. foreign policy?
Yes. So the funny that you're studying narrative is a bit of a fraught thing, because people always want to say, well, why, what about the truth? What should we just talk about what's actually going on? So I think the study of narrative, which, by the way, I've been doing for my entire career, has become hot now in part because of the way that political conversations are happening, the way in which arguments can be made that seem liberated from facts. So oddly enough, and this is one of the reasons why I think we're in a period of the return of ideology, why we need to be thinking about beliefs infused with passion, as Daniel Bell called it, as opposed to policy clusters, which is the way that the political science literature under Converse often thought about it in the end of the Cold War, is that in this environment, when anything you look at, and I like to think of the classic Gestalt image of the rabbit and the duck, right? That is, you look, the same stimulus is coming to you, but what you see is radically different based on what you bring to the picture. That's what's happening in the political environment. That's even without fragmented media environments. That's even without TikTok versus Fox News versus MSNBC. As we know, young people don't even watch cable, and so the way in which people are getting their information is so different than it ever has been. That's just going to exacerbate this what I'll call the importance of narrative, and the challenge of the way in which we formulate and conceptualize problems. And this is important to say too. I'm not just talking about media framing here, because that's what we often go to when we talk about this issue. That is, how do we, like the frame around a painting? What I'm talking about are fundamental ways in which we see the elemental antagonisms that are in play. For example, even the notion of backsliding. Backsliding comes from a 1778 lecture from John Wesley. This is a Methodist principle. So we're actually talking about a very ideological conversation here about a fundamental elemental antagonism between security states and liberty states. Those people who are promoting democracies, as we call it, which we really mean democratic republics, and those people who promote something else. So in this post-truth environment, oddly enough, the concept of narrative is hot, but I think we have to do it in the right way. We have to look at how narratives work. I call it formal narrative design. That is it's just not one story after another, anecdotes and whatever, but you can see how these things are structured. There are what I call a story grammar. There are things we can learn systematically about these arguments, even something like a concept that seems very scientific, like democratic backsliding.
Yeah, and we're almost out of time. Professor Truex, I wanted to leave the last word to you, because I've been following your Civic Forum initiative. So let's kind of talk about, just to kind of wrap it back, the idea of future-proofing democratic institutions, democracy versus autocracy. What, in your opinion, I know it's a big question, but what, in your opinion, is needed to negate or have the foresight to where democratic erosion, democratic backsliding can be maybe not stopped, but leveled off a little bit, because it can't continue as is, right? Because yes, governments come and go and leaders come and go, but there will reach a point that even I'm of the opinion that right now democracies, just because democracy in general is at a low point doesn't mean it will be. But at the same time, there does reach a point to where if 88 democracies are left in the world, that's not good either. So big question, but for the future of democratic systems itself, what should the focus be when it comes to, should it be focusing on like polarization? Should it be focusing on domestic policy, foreign policy, all the above? What do you think is needed foundationally to kind of negate the negation?
So how do we save democracy in 3 minutes?
Yeah, basically.
That's a tough one. I don't have a great answer to this. I would say a few things. One is human progress is nonlinear, right? So we've seen cycles like this before, where democracy is on the back foot, certainly in the interwar period. We also saw a lot of democratic backsliding in the 1960s and 70s. So things don't just all neatly flow in one direction. And I think we're in a kind of an authoritarian moment that hopefully will be corrected in some time. I think I would point to a couple of things. The first is I think there is a need to really think about political reform. That's not something people talk in China. Ironically, political reform is always talked about, and there's never actually any real political reform. But the idea of reform is something that is central to thinking over there, and we don't really talk about that much in this country. But it's quite clear that the democracy that we had, or perhaps had in a stronger fashion prior to Trump, wasn't quite working for people. I think there's a dissatisfaction with the two different political parties. We see partisanship actually declining. More and more people are identifying as independent. And I think there's a fundamental distrust in the system itself. And that's not going to be remedied just by the Democrats getting in power. It needs to be thought through about what are some of the political changes that can be made that would restore faith in the system. Why are Congress people still allowed to trade stocks? Why aren't we toying around with the idea of proportional representation a little bit more? Is there a way to reinvigorate and rejuvenate our political system? And I hope to see more. So that's my irrational optimism, is that I hope this moment energizes our democracy after it's over, and it gets people thinking more creatively about ways we can make it better. The second part of this is really a focus on polarization and inequality. We know that inequality, and by that I mean economic inequality, there's many different works in political science that point to inequality as bad for democracy. It empowers sort of these populist authoritarian figures that are able to appeal to the working class. It also creates incentive among the hyper elite, the wealthy, to side with authoritarian powers that curb redistribution. So inequality is bad for democracy, as is polarization. And both of those things are through the roof right now in the United States. And so I would like to see politicians explicitly talk more about healing, more about empathy with the other side, taking down the temperature. I see there's James Tallarico is an interesting politician. He's running for Senate in Texas. I think there will be this idea that kind of reducing polarization as a platform, as a political platform, I think is an interesting thing, and ditto for inequality. And so I think what we need is for democracy to function a little bit better. We need to not be tearing at the seams like we are, and only in that environment will backsliding be arrested.
Okay, so we are at time. I want to thank my panelists for going through all this. I know it was a lot, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Yeah, you in the audience, if you have follow-up questions, I'm sure the council's happy to answer them. But yeah, thank you to the three of you. I appreciate this. And again, thanks to the audience.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.